I'm going to I'm going to try to engage the video this evening, both the live video feed so I can demonstrate exercises and also interact a little bit more effectively on some of the presentation part. Also be recording this separately with the video, because the video, if you haven't been joining on these webinars, the video that you'll see live feed doesn't record as a part of the webinar. So when you watch the webinar, you won't see those feeds, so we record it separately. That'll be made available as well. I'm going to go ahead and start the video, and then we'll get into the presentation part of the webinar. It'll take a second for the video to get live here. Should be coming live here. If you have any issues, like I said, okay, so the video should be live. If you have any issues hearing or seeing me or seeing the presentation, just type into the chat box, and we'll go from there. So we're pretty much set to start. Again, tonight's webinar is going to be about lower body mechanics. Now, this webinar series is a basic overview, and we're going to touch on a lot of the core principles, but we aren't going to necessarily get into too much detail on the technical side of things. And even when we get into the exercise side of things, I'm going to keep it fairly light, but I'm going to give you real examples of how to create programs, why we're doing the things that we're doing, and then how to modify that, because ultimately there's an infinite number of variations that can be utilized as you get into the practical application side of this. All right, so we're going to start this part 2, which is going to be lower body mechanics driven. We're going to, just as a quick overview, next week go into core dynamics, and then the last week go into extremity and back dynamics, and then sort of tie it all together with bringing the lower body, the core, and the arms and back all together into essentially a full body program. We'll kind of fit that in at the end of the final week. So just sort of kind of frame where we want to go today here. We want to set some basic goals for what we're going to be accomplishing or trying to accomplish this evening. And these are general goals, but they're not necessarily specific yet to the technical side of things, but they are absolutely fundamental in understanding the information and then creating practical, functional programs that actually work, that are actually effective for changing dynamics and improving swing performance. So first thing that I want to try to do tonight is I want to try to reframe your perspective a little bit. When we're coming at this from a trainer's perspective, or we're coming at this from a coach perspective, we have a kind of a tunnel vision view of what we're trying to accomplish. And so a lot of times in that tunnel vision view, we get sort of sidetracked from some of the key elements that can really help us affect change in our athletes and affect performance in our athletes. So I want to give you some insight or some food for thought with respect to sort of reframing, looking at the bigger picture. Now, we don't want to get you away from your slice of the pie and where you're looking from either a coach or a training perspective, or injuries involved as a physical therapist or orthopedic doctor. But we do want to make sure that within your tunnel, within your slice of that pie, that you have a better overall perspective on what's occurring in the swing mechanism and what components impact performance. And now, again, we're really talking specifically about lower body here. Number 2, we want to create, as a function of changing that perspective or reframing or creating a larger perspective, we want to understand some of the basic underlying concepts. So again, a lot of what happens is twofold. If you're getting technical, a lot of times you jump into super technical before you really understand the basics. And then there's a lot of high-level information flowing around that sounds pretty but doesn't necessarily have impact because most of it is misunderstood. So we want to set a foundation of basic understanding before we get involved in the higher-level technical discussions. The other thing that tends to happen is, especially from a coaching perspective, but it definitely bleeds over into the training side of things, is a lot of what is being discussed is fairly vague, somewhat qualitative, very little quantitative nature to it, or objective measurement nature to it, and it's based on videos, or just, and the terminology can vary quite a bit. So you get people talking about the same things in different language, or same language and talking about different things. So it gets confusing. So we want to have a baseline, a foundation of the key underlying concepts with respect to movement, biomechanics, and we want to be able to have a quantitative way to look at it, and we want to be able to have a language that makes sense, that is consistent, so that we're talking about the same stuff, and the language makes sense with respect to the things that we're talking about. The last thing that we want to talk about this evening is creating working training programs, working practical application that has impact. And again, a lot of times what will happen here is both from a misinformation perspective, both the language issue as well as the technology, as well as sort of a misunderstanding of some of the underlying concepts. We get training programs that don't really have a lot of direction, and although they may look pretty or sort of embody some of the concept, they don't have real impact on movement and on performance. So our main goals are going to be to reframe our perspective, or give ourselves a big picture view of what's going on. We want to understand the underlying concepts as a basic foundation. Very simple, but it's important to have a good foundation. If you're building a house, if you're building a skyscraper of knowledge, you want to have a solid foundation. And then we want to talk about how do we use all this information, the perspective, the big view, the underlying concepts, to actually do something that will have impact, and will have impact on a significant, long-lasting, long-term kind of basis. So that's our goals for this evening. As we move forward here, one of the keys in this is and I'll just read from the slide, but how to develop an impactful functional movement training program. This is for the golf swing. I apologize. It should be for the baseball swing. You grab the slide from another presentation. But it's the same idea. What we want to do here is we want to demystify and simplify what we're talking about. So again, whether it's golf, unfortunately, with the slide here, or baseball or any sport, a lot of times, like I said in the previous slide, language is confusing. Concepts are kind of confusing or qualitative in nature, not necessarily objective, measurement-based kind of stuff. And so what's going on, and the discussion about what's going on, and then certainly what to do about it, which is the functional movement training part of that, is confusing. So what we want to do is we want to demystify and simplify the information and simplify that foundation so that we can create a functional movement part. So that really the primary starting point, or the kind of key to doing this, is creating a simple approach that has some key components. So essentially, as a function of this, we're creating very simple, very straightforward, but effective approaches to improving performance from a base level biomechanics perspective. So again, we want to reframe, we want to create an understanding of underlying concept, and we want to create functional programs by creating a very straightforward, quantitative, measurement-based, scientific, essentially based approach to what we're doing. A big part of this is clarity, providing some clarity in this sort of misty, mystical, kind of hodgepodge of stuff out there. And the big part of understanding what we're going to do here, and sort of the underpinning of the clarity, revolve around understanding that technology. So we're going to be talking about biomechanics, and the way we measure this stuff and the way we approach this stuff is technology-driven. Technology is not voodoo. Technology is really here to help you focus and expand what you already essentially intuitively know, right? And that's both as a coach, a trainer, and as an athlete yourself. I mean, almost everybody has played the sport to some level, some more than others, but we've all played the sport. And if we're coaching, training, we have an insight both from a player perspective, having played the sport, as well as a coach perspective. So we have both of those roles, both of those insights, and we know a lot about the swing mechanism just intuitively for having gone through this process of playing and coaching it, trying to essentially teach it both to juniors as well as high-level players. So we're not trying to tell you stuff you don't already essentially intuitively know, right? So we're not reinventing stuff. We're not pulling stuff out of thin air. What technology and the technology-based approach is essentially doing is clarifying or focusing and expanding the level at which you understand and can utilize what you already essentially know intuitively as a function of being a human being, and participating in these activities and then coaching these activities or teaching these activities. So clarity is going to be a big part of that, understanding that technology isn't that new. It's just a more advanced way to look at the things that we've already been looking at, and giving that reframe and that underlying basic foundational understanding on top of the stuff that we already know intuitively as a function of being involved in the sport. All right, so to get more specific about what we're going to approach this evening, what I'm going to do is first I want to, of course we've covered the basics, but we want to get into when we're developing an effective swing training approach, we want to have some goals, and we want to have structure to what we're doing, and we want to have progression to what we're doing. So I'm going to talk a little about the concepts behind developing programs, what goes into that. We're going to talk about how we create goals, where they come from, and essentially the foundation behind how we're creating these goals. The structure is very important. So once we have goals for a training program, we have to have a certain structure that will have impact. And then as a part of that structure, we want to have progression. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically that the nervous system responds, motor learning patterns are developed through structure and progression. So we're going to talk specifically about this. And again, this is a overview webinar this evening, but we will get into some detail. We'll then talk about lower body mechanics specifically. We'll talk about just really briefly and very lightly. It's going to be a quick, super simple, quick overview. We're going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of lower body mechanics. And then we'll talk more specifically about swing biomechanics and the components that go into lower body movement and why we're doing it and how we're doing it and how that has impact on understanding performance. Then we're going to talk about creating programs and how far we get into it and all that, but we want to definitely talk about how do we use all this information that we're going to cover to actually create an effective basic training program for any level athlete, from junior athlete, your young kids, your little leaguers, all the way up through to your high-level athletes, your Major League Baseball players, your college athletes, minor league players as well. So we want to have an idea of what a basic approach would be, but basic doesn't mean low end. Basic means, and we'll explain more when we get there, but the components that are involved. Basic is going to have just one primary component. Those components can be used for every level of play. We'll talk hopefully a little bit about how we can advance a basic program, and typically advancing the basic program is going to boil down to adding into essentially a movement pattern training or functional movement pattern training, or what we refer to as progressive skills training, adding into that component, which is your basic stuff, some additional exercises that will embody functional movement, and then we can get into advanced programs that include additional functional movement as well as more traditional kind of strength and conditioning, and kind of show you how all that stuff essentially can dovetail together. So as far as goals go, and I'm not going to spend too much time on all this because we do have limited time. Most when we get into this stuff, even on a kind of a basic level, usually the seminars are at least a couple hours, and this is just an hour overview, so we don't take too much time. But we do want to hit this stuff enough that we have some sense of where we're going with this stuff. So when you are assessing an athlete, and when you are going to create a training program for swing performance that is specific to the area of, say, lower body mechanics, you have to have a goal. So in other words, and it may sound super simple, but if you go around to your baseball academies, even go to your universities, and even to some degree at your highest level, your Major League Baseball organizations, you would think that there is some very clear-cut, definable goals. But in many cases, because of the things I just mentioned, that the fact that the underlying concepts aren't very well understood, because there hasn't been a good evaluation process of the athlete, many other components, there aren't really good clear-cut goals that are sound and based on something. So a goal is a really important part of creating a program. In other words, you have to have a clear-cut, definable, and focused reason for training. What is it we're trying to accomplish? And to get there, you have to have some sort of evaluation process. You have to analyze, you have to define issues or problems, and then you have to have some sort of definable outcome. So you're going to do some sort of data collection process. Now, at Xenolink we do a high-level 3D motion assessment, and we add in other components of technology for that. But the evaluation process can be as simple as watching the hitter or videotaping the hitter. But there has to be some sort of evaluation or data gathering process, even if it's just you watching the hitter. There has to be some analysis of that, and that analysis has to be structured and based on something. And obviously that something has to be sound and based in some factual or scientific grounding. And from that analysis, you have to be able to, in a clear-cut, simple way, define issues or define some sort of problem with performance. Once you've done all this, now you essentially have to be able to define an outcome. So we have this process boiling down to what is it that we're trying to get out of the athlete. Now, this is a basic overview, and obviously each one of these points can be expanded, and we can talk for quite some time on. But this simple approach, which seems fairly straightforward and almost like, well, yeah, why wouldn't you do that, is not done as much as you would think. And as a function of that, programs are not very effective and don't typically get the kind of results that they should, or any results at all for that. So again, you have to have that goal, a clear-cut, definable, focused reason for training, and as a function of getting there, we have to have some sort of evaluation process, some sort of analysis of the data that's gathered, some sort of factual and structured way to define an issue and problem, and then create a definable outcome, and that's our goal. What are we trying to accomplish at the end of the day with this hitter? So that seems pretty straightforward, but that's absolutely crucial. If you don't start there, if you don't have some sort of systematic way to approach this, you've already essentially sunk your ship. You've already essentially, really diminished your ability to make good progress with your athlete. And you got to remember, obviously the athlete's goal and aspirations and who knows how far they would go, livelihood for that matter, can be dependent on your ability to do this simple part of it. And if you're not doing it effectively, you're not doing the job and you're not really serving your athlete effectively. So we'll go from there, we'll go into structure. So once you've done that initial part, you have to have a plan. And it doesn't have to be a complicated plan. I think one of the things that people get into or get involved in or kind of feel compelled to do is to make their plans extremely fancy, extremely complicated. They hear people talking about the newest, latest, greatest in whatever it is, functional movement or, the intensity interval training or whatever it might be. There's all kinds of different new stuff that comes out all the time, and it sounds fancy, and you feel to some degree that you have to have a fancy plan, and you don't. In fact, I would say in most cases, the simpler the plan, the better off you are. But you have to have a plan. So once you've gone through that goal-setting process, now you create some structure. There's a plan. How do we get from point A to point B? How do we get from where this athlete is to where we want them to be? So there has to be some structure, some plan. Now, the plan doesn't have to be rigid. It doesn't have to be hyper fixed in its time frame and its outcome, all that. And it can be fluid. And to be totally honest with you, I think you have to have structure, you have to have a plan, but you have to be ready and willing to be fluid with the plan as you progress through a plan based on how your athlete responds. I think it's foolish to think that you know everything at the outset and that your athlete is going to track perfectly with no issue and you'll know everything you need to do when you start. You start with a plan, you continuously assess your plan as you go on almost a daily basis, and you are fluid enough or flexible enough to adjust the plan without wholesale scrapping it, but adjust the plan to meet the needs and make sure that you're going towards your goal. So structure is a big part of where we're trying to go with this stuff and very important. And the last part of this is progression. I think a lot of times, especially with coaching, not as much with training, because training, when you're looking at strength conditioning in particular, progression, periodization, stuff like that is definitely a part of what's taught, what's sort of known about training and advancing athletes. But with coaching, not as much. So you got to remember, even if you're just coaching mechanics with the athlete, some video, or just watching the athlete swing, you have to have, as you set up these goals and the structure to get to where you're going, you have to have some progression in what you're doing. In other words, you don't do the same thing all the time throughout the entire program. You have to have some way to create a progression. So when you do this, especially when you're teaching patterns of movement, and that goes for hitting, but that goes for all kinds of stuff, you want to start with small digestible parts. You want to add the parts together for more complex movement, and then ultimately you want to add speed. So you don't want to start necessarily doing things at full out speed immediately. You want to build the base. You want to create a more complex base that's more activity specific and more functional base, and then you add your power and your speed components. Remember that this stuff will be novel to any level athlete. So you got to remember that too. And again, you don't have a lot of time to get into all the nitty-gritty of this stuff. But a key thing to remember is that even your high-level athletes, so you may think, well, that makes sense with the kids that I'm working with, but yeah, it probably doesn't make sense with the college athlete I'm working with or the pro athlete I'm working with. But it's the same thing. So understand, no matter what level that athlete is at, what you're asking them to do when you're asking them to change movement pattern or to evolve movement pattern, improve movement pattern, is you're asking them to start to adopt novel patterns, new patterns. So when you're asking even the highest level athlete to adopt a new pattern, a new way of moving, you have to start with small digestible parts. So we do this with our junior athletes, but we honestly do this stuff with our Major League Baseball guys. Same basic progressions. It starts very simple. It starts slowly. It gets linked together, and then it gets more advanced as we move forward. And then as a function of creating these digestible parts that you link together and you create in a progressive way, you also want to have some sort of systematic escalation or somehow increase the challenge of the demand. So you're not only increasing or sort of advancing the complexity of the movements, but you're also heightening or escalating the challenge or the intensity with which the athlete is producing. That can be, and again, we don't have time to get into all the details, but a simple way to think of this is you can simply improve or advance the intensity by adding volume. I mean, there's many ways you can do it, but one simple way is volume. So you're adding intensity. So one week you do so many sets and reps, and the next week you do the next, and you kind of advance more sets and reps, and kind of increase the volume. Is just a simple way to increase intensity or escalate the challenge of what is going on, and then the nervous system continues to respond. And again, we can get into more detail down the road as we get into more advanced levels of this instruction. But when you're talking about goals, when you're talking about structure, you're talking about progression, if you follow these simple rules, you're going to have much, much better success, even with a very simple program, the more straightforward it is to some of you. So here's the basic anatomy of lower body mechanics, and this is going to be, I don't want to get into like anything really in depth this evening. We don't have the time, or is this webinar really designed for this, but one of the things really basic, and I think this, although it's really simple, and again, many will say, well, yeah, no kidding, I still think it's important to understand this stuff, because what I've seen in the almost 25 years I've been doing this is that it sounds really simple. Someone says it to you and say, oh yeah. But when you really look at what you do, and when you look around at your peers and see what the peers are doing, you'll see on a day-to-day basis, on a kid-to-kid or a team-to-team basis, most of the stuff is not done, or not done effectively. But in many cases, not even done. So it's easy to say, oh yeah, that makes sense, and it's certain. But to actually employ it is a challenge. But when employing it, you're going to get much better results. So the basic part I want to get into as far as the anatomy of this is, we're going to talk about ground reaction forces and how the body uses ground reaction forces to produce movement at the lower body, and then we're going to get into the exercises here, trying to keep my time. But I wanted to talk about the fact that the force that we're talking about here is predominantly caused through extension. So our extensors are our big, powerful muscles, and they're the ones that are essentially driving the force production process that we're going to be harnessing to then create lower body movement. And simply, I'll just grab my pen here for a second. Simply what we're talking about is hip extension predominantly. So if we talk about, let's see, color here, hip extension, right, and knee extension. So extension at the hip and extension at the knee are going to be our primary mechanisms for creating force, for employing force, for driving force into the ground and then using the reaction to that force that's being driven into the ground to then produce movement and then turn that movement into swing dynamics. So it's important to understand that those are our primaries. So extension, and this is true of other sports as well, but extension is going to be absolutely key. Now it's key even when it's not dynamic, even when it's isometric in nature, you're still applying force into the ground. So even when you don't see a lot of, like seeing a jump, I'm going to show you here in a second on some of the slides, but if you look at, say, for example, a vertical leap, there's a lot of knee movement, there's a lot of hip movement, there's a lot of dynamics in that, and you'll say, okay, yeah, it makes sense. My quads are driving that knee extension, my glutes are driving that hip extension. It looks dynamic. I get that. And in the baseball swing, in some swings, it looks pretty obvious, especially with the lead leg kind of stiffening and extending into the ground. But in many cases, a lot of the force is being generated through the extension process. In other words, the glutes and the quads at the knee and the hip. But it is done semi-isometrically. And so you don't see a big, dramatic, dynamic change of say, angle with the knee and the hip. But there's a lot of force being generated, even if there's not a lot of range of motion being utilized. So it's important to understand where is the force coming from and how do we impact that force production. And so very simply, from a really rough anatomical perspective, the force is being created at the hip and at the knee through extension. So it's primarily engaging the glutes and the quads. Right? Glutes affecting our hip extension and our quads essentially affecting impacting our knee extension. So that's an important, simple but important thing to understand as we move forward into the biomechanics part. So we are going to move into this lower body biomechanics component. So from a swing biomechanics perspective, I like to talk about, and this is how we've broken the webinar down, I like to talk about three, what I would refer to as primary drivers. The primary drivers are the fundamental areas. And you can get into a lot of finer discussion, but at the end of the day, there's some really key basic areas that drive the swing mechanism. And in this case, what we're talking about is lower body. That's what we're talking about this evening. We're talking about core or torso movement. We're talking about upper body movement, and that's what we're going to talk in subsequent weeks. So tonight, talking about the number one primary driver in the chain, which is the lower body. And to some degree, the sequence or coordination of these events drives the importance level. So as a primary driver, the lower body is really probably the key and the most important primary driver because it starts the process. It's not only the foundation for developing power, but it's the foundation, if you think of just literally a foundation, it's the foundation for then all the other components of the sequence to take place. So you've got a lot of key elements to the lower body, and it occurs first in the sequence. So if stuff goes wrong there, you're already compensating as you move down the chain. So lower body is significant and incredibly important, and is to some degree the absolute foundation of the primary driver. So much of what we'll talk about down the road will stem from how well we use our lower body and create swing movement and power. All right, so let's talk about ground reaction force here just a little bit, and I want to leave myself enough time to at least cover the basics. And I will provide the slide presentation as well to everyone as a PDF so that you can go back and you don't have to watch an hour's worth of video to get through it. You can just kind of go to the slides. But this fundamental stuff I think is as important as anything, and I really want to make sure I cover it and then leave enough room for at least the basic program, and then just talk a little bit about how we advance the program as we move forward. But this idea of ground reaction force is actually a fairly simple one, but has been made to be fairly complex and sometimes confusing just by the delivery of the information. But I think if you go back to my comment about clarity is, and this idea of intuitive feel for stuff, we use ground reaction forces every day to do simple tasks, walking down the street, walking upstairs, jumping, or whatever, running. It's very simple tasks, all involve our ability to produce force and then use the ground's reaction to that force through the lower body to then create joint movement and overall patterning. So our ground reaction force concepts are actually just illuminating what we already kind of know and feel and use every day. So the first idea, or the first part of the ground reaction force is understanding essentially applied force, and we're going to talk simply with respect to the vertical components, which are the most obvious, and people best understand those. And so here's the basic concept. The basic concept is if I apply a force into the ground, so if I'm applying a force vertical or sort of perpendicular to a surface, so I have my drawing here of a guy producing a vertical leap. I'm going to use my hip extensors and my knee extensors. So using my glutes and my quads to extend the knee and the hip to push into the ground. And I'm essentially going to apply a downward force into the ground. So the force is going to be applied in this direction. The ground on the other side of the equation is responding to the force that I apply, and it will respond with an equal and opposite force. So that means equal in magnitude. So if I push down with so many pounds of force, it's going to push back with so many pounds of force. Right? So magnitude will be equal, and the direction will be equal. If I push vertical, I will get a vertical response. Right? So, and that's important. So when we jump, we are essentially pushing down to move up. So we're applying the force downward. The reaction to that force from the ground is upward, and it's that upward force that we use to then lift our bodies into the air. So the first thing is to understand applied force and ground reaction. We apply a force into a surface, and the surface responds back with an equal and opposite force. The second thing to understand is that there is a vertical component to force, and that is the force that we call normal or perpendicular to the surface of anything that we're standing on. Okay? So, and I don't want to get into the nuances of it, because if you're standing at an angle, even if you're applying forces at an angle, there is still a vertical component, and then what we're going to talk about is a horizontal component or shear component, but you're always still going to get some vertical component, unless you're literally vertical, and there's no way to actually apply a vertical force or a normal force. So normal force or vertical force and the applied force with the ground reaction to it, that's number one. That's what we want to understand. Push down to go up. Okay? Now, let's take a look at this idea of now horizontal force. So in something like walking, let's say, we're using a downward force into the ground to create friction. So as we push into the ground to walk, we are pushing, one part of the force is going downward. Okay, so that's our vertical or normal. That's what we just talked about. And that force is essentially used to create a foot-ground interface. I just refer to it, the easiest way to think of it is friction. Okay, so the ability to connect to the ground so that then we can apply a force that is horizontal to the surface of the ground. So when we're walking, if you look at our little schematic here, we're trying to, say, walk forward. We are going to push backward against the ground. So we push down into the ground to create some interface, and then we push horizontally to create the forward movement. So we push backward to go forward. And that force is essentially being applied along the surface of the ground. If we don't have some interface with the ground, we'll just slip. We won't be able to apply that force. So essentially, it's the downward component that is creating, well, think about it this way. If you're walking on ice, and even when you're pushing down, you aren't able to create a good interface. When you push, your foot just slips, and you don't move forward, right? So you have to have a good interface and not slip to be able to push against the ground backward to move forward. So you've got your downward components. That's your vertical force that's creating interface. And then you've got your horizontal components, and those components are the ones that we're utilizing for movement at this point. So the downward's creating the interface, and once we have an interface, we're using our shear or our horizontal forces to create movement. So we've covered the basics of ground reaction. Ground reaction forces, we have an applied force and we get a reaction of equal and opposite. That's a pretty simple one, but it's an important one. And then if we break our forces into 3 dimensions, we basically have vertical and horizontal components, or normal and shear components to our force application. Okay? So that's kind of the basics, and that's kind of where we'll end for this evening as far as describing the ground reaction. Now let's talk specifically about the baseball swing and what this all means as far as creating movement. Okay. So let's take a look at this. See if I can back up here. See if I can get this video here so you can kind of describe a little bit better. So in the baseball swing, if you can't hear me as I move away from the light, just let me know. But in the baseball swing, what we're essentially doing is we're using downward force. So as we create that swing pattern, we're pressing down into the ground. And again, a lot of it is somewhat isometric. I can be engaged and not necessarily have a lot of motion, but be pushing into the ground and creating that downward force to create that interface. So it's important to have interface, foot to ground interface. When I push down to create the interface, I am now going to use the horizontal forces to then create movement. So if you look at the little schematic, let's say to initialize our forward swing in baseball swing, what we're doing is we're pushing down into the ground to create interface. And then essentially what we're doing is we're pushing horizontally like this, the ground pushes back like this, and that scissoring response from the ground creates a torque. So essentially what we're doing is we're using our ability to push like this against the ground to create a torque at the pelvis. Now, the torque essentially is at our feet, but we take that torque or that force coupling that's at the feet and we translate it through the feet, the ankles, the knees, and hips up to the pelvis, so that we're essentially applying that force at the pelvis to create a rotational movement of the pelvis. So we've got our downward forces that are creating the interface, and then we've got our horizontal forces that are creating the torque. So I'll go to the next slide, which is basically just showing what I just described. So I'll just kind of quickly show that slide again. So essentially what we're doing here is essentially pushing down to create the interface, and then pushing horizontal to the floor or to the surface, and then using the reaction force of pushing into the tip to create a rotation. So the shear or the horizontal component is what we're really utilizing to create speed. And it's from our lower body speed that we create the momentum that allows us to channel speed or momentum through the body out the arm and then ultimately the movement itself. So key components are being securely and effectively connected to the ground. We have to have a good interface to the ground, number one. Number two, we have to know how to use that interface to the ground to create this torque effect of the pelvis to create good hip. Okay? So that's how ground reaction, the idea of normal or vertical and horizontal shear play a role in our ability to create a rotational speed output. Okay? So that is essentially the rotational component of our lower body. Now, the next thing that we need to talk about here is what I refer to more as the linear component, sort of what drives the ability to create the shear component. Okay? So it's essentially boils down to balance, and has a lot to do with how we push into the ground to create the interface. But it's essentially looking at the relationship between the center of mass, essentially, the sort of this imaginary kind of position right about the navel, a little bit outside the body here. So we have essentially a center of mass, body here, and then as we step on the ground, we're creating pressure or creating a force across the surface area that then be calculated with the center of pressure between the two feet. And what happens is if I stand stationary and in balance, my center of pressure between my 2 feet, which is the applied force across that surface area, my center of pressure will essentially line up with my center of mass. So if you look at the schematic on the diagram on the computer, you'll see I have this center of mass lined up with the center of pressure. Right? So you've got your center mass, line up your center pressure, and then balance. Right? So what we do is to initiate the swing, to drive the swing, and create the dynamics that will create the rotational torque for it, is that we manipulate our center of mass, center of pressure, so that we create some dynamics. Right? So if I'm just standing here like this in static balance, I'm not going to necessarily go anywhere. Right? So I have to move myself essentially in and out of balance to create movement. So what we do in a baseball swing, and let's just take the obvious when we're actually taking the stride and making movement. But if you think about it, so when I'm standing ready for the pitch to be thrown, my center of mass is essentially right over my center of pressure because I'm balanced and I'm not falling over. Okay? But now what happens is, as the pitch is coming towards me, I pick my foot up to strike forward. As I pick my foot up, my center of pressure moves to the back foot. Now my front foot for that brief instant in time isn't even connected to the ground. I'm not on the ground at all. But my center of pressure has to be back behind me. My center of mass is still, for that moment up here. So what's happening? The center of pressure is back here. My center of mass is here. I'm going to fall this direction. So essentially what you're doing is you're setting up this fall, right? You're setting up a forward fall. So what you do is you use the forward fall. So center of pressure, center of mass, I fall forward. I use my fall. I essentially catch myself. So when you walk, you essentially fall, catch, fall, catch, fall, catch. So you use the same principles when you walk. So that's what I was kind of saying like earlier. This is the stuff you do every day. If I didn't explain it to you, you still get up tomorrow, or you're going to get up from your desk or wherever you're at, and you go walk over to the fridge, you're going to use your reaction forces, and you're going to fall and catch yourself every step that you take, and you won't even know it, and everyone's going to walk perfectly fine. So it's already something that's built into what we do. We're intuitive about it, so if we understand it, we can harness it, and we can improve it. So the idea is picking my foot up, even if I just do a little move, even if I just do little gyrations, I'm still shifting that center of pressure relative to my center of mass and creating momentum. I'm essentially, quote unquote, falling. It's the fall that I then use that forward momentum to push harder into the ground like this, and to create a large torque, which then creates a lot of pelvic rotational movement and obviously a lot of pelvic rotational speed. So the relationship between my ability to create interface, or that friction and balance, the ability to be able to shift my center of pressure, the force applied to the feet relative to my center of mass, and that ability then produces the ability to push along the surface of the ground to create torque, which then fire clamps to create rotation speed. That's sort of the foundation of the swing pattern. Absolutely crucial. Got to have it, got to do it effectively. Everything else from there starts to be compensation. Right? So this is a really, really important part of what we want to understand with respect to lower body effects. All right. So now we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty here. So let me grab my chair here. And then we'll get into the exercises. I'll show you some of these things and how this whole thing works. So I understand this now, and I've made some assessment. Hopefully you've used a 3D product and you've got some really good information, but even if you're just using video or you're just using your eyes, you've done some assessment as to how effectively somebody is producing the lower body mechanics that we just talked about. And you know, did they blend the linear with the rotational effectively? How much torque did they create? How much speed did they create? Where did they break down? You know, all those kinds of things. It can be very complex. It can be very simple, but you have to have some starting point. All right. So once you have some sort of starting point, and you've gotten to the point where you've done all the stuff that we talked about, you know, setting the goals, the structure, the progressions, all that kind of stuff. The program, to be effective, has to embody essentially really 5 key components. First of all, we have to be able to create a ground interface. So in other words, we have to have some sort of foot ground awareness, and we have to be able to utilize the foot ground awareness to create a solid interface with the ground so that we can push horizontally and create the torque that we need to create speed and produce movement. As a function of that, we need to have some component in our program that is impacting balance. And balance is going to boil down to what I just described in terms of the relationship between center of pressure, center of mass. So you're using your good contact with the ground to create balance and awareness of moving and shifting center of pressure, center of mass. So your program has to embody, your lower body training program has to embody that component. The next thing, once we've got those two working, is we have to have the ability to impact our torque production or our shear force or our horizontal force production as a function of good interface and shifting center of pressure, center of mass. So these things have to be incorporated. Then what we want to then obviously be able to do is we want to be able to translate effectively the torque that's being created more at the ground level, right, at the surface level. We need to be able to translate that up through the joints from the feet to the ankles to the knees to the pelvis, and then create the ability to then utilize all that torque that's been pushed up the system to the pelvis to then create a good torque mechanism and a good pushing mechanism through the hips, the hip joints themselves, push on essentially the pelvis, rotate, create movement and speed. So that's a key component there. And then lastly, as we're doing the first four, we have to be able to create a stable foundation for everything else to take place. So we have to have some component of stability. So you have to have all five of these components in. You can try to break some of them out independently, but I think you also want to have, to some degree, all five components as a basis of the majority of the exercises that we're producing. So even if your exercise is going to, say, be biased a little bit towards ground interface, or be biased a little bit towards center pressure, center mass, or be biased, you have a slant, there still all those components should be involved in the process itself to make it an effective lower body program and to allow an athlete to start to incorporate all those fields and all those mechanisms into producing lower body movement. All right, now we get into some of the fun stuff. All right, so, and we're not doing too bad on time, so I'm doing all right. If you look at any swing pattern, it doesn't really matter, baseball or otherwise, but the biggest issue is typically with the lower body is essentially foot ground awareness. The ability to create stable foundation and all the things that we talked about with respect to torque production and all that. But it really stems from a lack of awareness of your foot against the ground and what your foot's actually doing. So a lot of what we want to do is just wake up the feet and wake up the nervous system to have a better sense of what the feet and the ground are doing. And so maybe that sounds overly simple, but if you can do that, you've won a big part of the battle of improving lower body mechanics. So I set up this very simple progression, a way to increase intensity by simply adding sets of exercises. So volume, very simply. I say start simply with volume, and then you can get more involved in different levels of intensity and different approaches to periodization and all that. But to start, when you're just teaching sort of the baby steps of this stuff, you're best off keeping it simple, and the simplest way to increase intensity is volume, especially for learning, and especially for, and what we're really looking at here is this is going to be initially, and I don't have a ton of time, so we can't get into all specifics, but initially, when you start this process, you have to have some portion of essentially linear block training. So you've got to, there's pros and cons to sort of more random types of training and all that, but you have to have some component, especially initially when you're setting the foundation, of essentially sort of block style learning, and there has to be some linear progressions in that block style learning to set the foundation. And then once you go beyond that, then you can get fancier about how you periodize this stuff and how you look at your training, including randomization and other styles of periodization and all that. But initially, you want it simple and straightforward. So here's what I would set up as a basic level program. Not basic because they're baby exercises for little kids or for non-professionals, whatever. But basic because all it involves is movement pattern exercise. So it's basic only because it's just movement pattern or functional coordination, and it becomes more advanced as we add other components to the mix. So it's not basic in terms of the level of impact as much as it is basic in terms of the types of components that are being employed to affect change. So I'm going to set up the camera so that I can film this part of it a little bit more effectively. While I'm doing that, just give me a second here. And I'll try to set this camera up so I can get a good view for you as well. This camera isn't the best. I'll have to do my best to okay, so give me 1 second here. Okay, so this is a pretty simple start, but it's absolutely very crucial. I didn't put all the data up there, but here's the idea. The stride setup is going to be really important, and a lot of people don't get it right. So right away, one of the things that we measure, you can do this just without any real 3D or anything like that, by just making some measurements. But a good lower body for a baseball team, a good lower body stride is going to be about 3.5 to 4 times hip width. So if you make a measurement from hip center to hip center, whatever that is, it doesn't vary a whole lot on an adult level, but it will vary a little bit as you know, if you look at younger kids and whatnot. But if you look at the measurement from hip center to hip center, your stride length should be 3.5 to 4 times. So let's just say right in the middle, 3.75 times hip width. And that's really important. If you overstride or you understride, you're going to greatly impact your ability to create torque. And again, I will go on, this comes off of a lot of research, and that research is published. I'll give you links to some of that research as we move forward. But it's 3.75 times hip width. Okay? So that's really important. Direction is also important. It varies a little bit, but let's say on average, you want the stride to be closed in about 10 degrees. 10 degrees isn't a lot, but it's substantial. You don't want to swing the stride to be either directly forward, 0, or worse, open. Okay? You want the stride to be about 10 degrees. If you look at a line drawn from the ankles to the ankles, you want that the direction to be about 10 degrees off of the line that goes directly back to the hip. You want it 3.75 times hip width in distance, and you want it 10 degrees close in terms of direction. The front foot should be at a position of roughly 65 degrees. Okay? So this is 0, and this is 90, pointing straight to the pitcher. So if this is 0, and this is 90, pointing straight to the pitcher, 65 is like that. So I've got a stride length from ball foot to ball foot, 3.75 times hip width. I've got 10 degrees close, I've got 65 degree foot position. If you look at the research, no matter what the style of swing is, that stride mechanism has very little variance. So no matter what it happens to do when we're getting ready to go up and pick up, making your foot down, that stride position is what I just said, plus or minus a few degrees, plus or minus a few percent in terms of hip width. It's very, very, very consistent. It's very important. So one of the things I like to do to start is to just map out, draw right on the floor. You can have I literally have a map and I draw stuff out and mark it off. Get these people, get your athletes in this stride position. The back foot is essentially square to the line of action. Get them in the stride position so they can feel it. And that's the stride position that we're going to use moving forward so that they can use to producing force, shifting weight, and create interface from an effective stride position. That one may be the most important thing you could possibly do. It certainly is the sort of start point for the things that we want to do for all the other background. Okay, now sitting counter. So we're going to have a couple components here. So we're going to be sitting, and I'm using like a 75 centimeter switch ball. You can use a chair, you can use all, I think the switch ball is a nice dynamic stability ball for it to go. But basically what I want to do then is I want to get my feet in the position that I just described. I want about 3.75 times hip width. I want 2 degrees close, 10 degrees close, and a 65 degree foot angle. I want to get my feet in the position that I want my strider. I want to lock down, and I want to create interface. You can even do this in bare feet, so they have a better feel for gripping the ground. As long as they create friction, and they're not slipping on the surface. You don't want them slipping, you want them to be able to grip. But you want them in this position. Right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to teach them how to create the torque. The torque, but we're embodying all those other components. We're going to embody the interface, we're going to embody the relation, because we have a little bit of ability to move here, we're going to embody the relationship of center mass and pressure. Even though we're not moving a lot, we're controlling it. Okay? And we're then using those as the foundation to create torque. And then, but we're not going too much further than that because of the translation from the dynamic sense. But we're getting all those pieces components, even the foundational part. This is allowing us to create foundation. So what we do with this is we use this position to then create counter torque. So what we're talking about as far as counter torque is, what I want to do is you can have the hands, you can put your hands up on the chest, you can point the shoulder, whatever, just get the arms out of the equation. And you can even, at some point, have them grab the baseball bat and kind of hold it back, just kind of mimic more of a baseball movement. Well, all we want to do is we want to create a separation where we rotate the upper thoracic and the upper torso to some degree. It doesn't have to be a lot, but to some degree relative to the lower body. We want the lower body to hold position and actually create a counter torque moving this way. Even though I'm isometrically holding this position for the most part, and I'm not dynamically going through a swing pattern, I want to hold a counter torque to produce this rotation. So I'm in this set zone, right? So it's a kind of a ready position for hitting. And then what I want to do, create this counter torque to my lower body and create this separation here, because I want to then very slowly move back to a neutral. So what I've done is, so I've created this counter torque, and then I'm using the counter torque to create torso movement. So what I'm essentially, and what you'll find when you do this yourself, or you have your athletes do it, is in order to do this, you will see that they are shifting. In fact, I'm doing a teaching seminar in a couple of days, and I'm going to do all this stuff on force plate and show people that even when I'm standing here, you're going to get the force production and the torque production that we're talking about, even though it seems really simplistic and not dynamic. So what's happening is I'm creating that starting point, and I've shifted, even though I'm not moving center pressure, center mass a whole lot, I'm controlling that relationship. And then as I swing forward, it's connected. So as I swing my upper torso, using this anchor as a lower body, I'm now creating, first I'm creating kind of the counter torque movement, then I'm creating the forward acceleration dynamic, and then I'm stabilizing. So I'm creating all of the 5 components that I put down on my list and do the really simple exercise. Which you'll find though, you keep your high level athletes kind of innovation, certainly your younger athletes, have no sense of being able to do this at all. It seems really, really simple, but it's not simple, and it's absolutely important stepping stone. Now remember, when we create these programs, what we're essentially doing is we're sort of creating an environment much like children learn how to walk, right? A kid isn't born walk. A child doesn't just get up when they walk. Even if it looks like they did, they did. They basically went through a process of gaining core control by being able to roll over, pick their head up. Once you're able to roll over and control your core dynamic, gain some core control, using the cores to core that and move extremity. Right? That's where rolling over to the first step, and then holding your head up, and maybe crawling a little bit to the next step. And you progress through these things, you don't just walk. So that progression is sort of what we're setting up here. So we want to have all 5 of the components embodied in a simple exercise that is essentially akin to a baby rolling over, being able to control the core and have some sense of the limbs and be able to facilitate that movement as that first step. So our first step there is the sitting counter torque, is again, create the counter torque. You're going to see the weight shifting underneath the feet, even though there's not a lot of dynamic, and then swing forward with the upper torso. You're basically swinging forward, and now you're creating the forward dynamic that you want to see and the stability at the same time with all those components built up. So that's something that we might do. So we set some of the reps, start to build that foundation, so to build that neural control, that you have the neural impact, and work through this part to go to the next part. The next part is now standing counter torque. So what I like to do is now, let's go to the standing counter torque with lower body isolation. So I've chosen a smaller ball where I can actually put my feet at the distance I want them, and I can organize them in the stride position. So everything we do, we go back to number one: stride set, stride set, stride set. We're not picking our foot up. We're not doing anything dynamic. We're putting them where they should be, and we're working them from that position, taking that variable out of the equation. Okay? So in this position, all we're doing is what we were doing when we were sitting, is we're using this ball as a cue to stay stable and to interact effectively as a foundation. And all we're going to do is create the counter torque, right? And then we're going to swing forward. Right? Very simple. Take the counter torque and then swing forward. So what we're doing essentially is the same thing we were doing when we were sitting. All the components are involved, and now we're standing. A little bit more complex, but it's a little bit more direct. Now, the shear forces that we're creating in the lower body are now being translated more through the stacked legs, right, through the feet, the ankles, the hip. And we're creating more of this action. When we're sitting, we are creating that, but it's not as stacked, it's not as functional, it's not as close to the hitting mechanism as this action. So again, sets and reps of this, perfecting that, developing that sequence, and building to the next level. So we're going down this systematic approach. Now, let's get into the activity, but now without the ball. So now we don't have the cue, they're on the same orientation, but now there's a lot more ability to move in different ways that we don't necessarily want the athlete to do. So we emphasize the feel that we had when we were cued and isolated to create the counter torque and then the swing forward. So it doesn't look like here's the thing, is that it doesn't look like I'm doing anything with my lower body. And you say, well, that's counterintuitive because we talk about lower body, we're trying to get our lower body to move more effectively, but yet in these exercises, we haven't seen them move the lower body. Well, we're not moving the lower body, but we are creating all of the components for really effectively. We do get to the point where we want to allow the athlete to now move dynamically. So in this basic program, as a starting point, most of it is lower body isolation and stats, and a little bit of movement at the end. But as we now say we progress over 3 to 4 weeks, 6 weeks, depending on the athlete and what's going on, we can then now move into more complex movements, so branching stuff like creating and dynamic, and eventually move into speed. Okay? You've got your standing counter torque with the lower body isolation, and you got your standing counter torque with no isolation and having sort of the cue on your own to do it, right? Now, the next one is a dynamic movement, and it's really designed to set up the sort of the lower body, upper torso relationship. And I call it a change of direction. How it starts with isolation and you move away from it. It's always set the guy up in his stride position with this. And what I would do is you can take something simple, because you can have implements that you can go buy stuff, and there's all kinds of big chains that you can use. But mine will just use what you have, right? So you've got a baseball bat. Basically, just hold the barrel, right? You can hold the bat out in front. And to start, we're going to go quick ranges of motion slow, right? So what we're doing is we're essentially moving about 60 degrees, let's say, to 60 degrees. And we're just going to move back. So one rep would be a full rotation. So that'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now it looks like all I'm doing is moving my arm. So basically, in terms of this direction, what I'm doing is maybe like a 45. What I'm doing here is I'm moving my upper torso. But what you'll see is, in order to do that, as soon as I start to move back this direction, I'm creating a counter torque the opposite way. As soon as the bat starts moving this direction, I'm creating a counter torque the other way. So I'm creating a core differential. But really what I'm doing is sort of vibrationally, if you think of it, almost sinusoidally, moving back and forth, creating that dynamic connection, friction, center pressure, center mass relationship, torque or shear or horizontal relationship, and then facilitating the movement up through the floor. So you start to wake that part of the process up. The last thing that I would do in the basic program would be to then chunk the stuff together into an actual kind of swing pattern, right? So again, let's use our Swiss ball as a cue. We're going to now employ that. Okay? But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to create the same dynamic that we just did. We'll open the hips up for a bit, the pelvis up, kind of do a little bit of dynamic in there to sort of wake up the spot. Now all we're going to do is sort of chunk through sort of segment this way to create a swing pattern to sort of finish up this exercise series, but emphasize what we just did in the first particular exercise. So we've got a side position, we're creating counterpoint with the good interaction next to the, then we're going to close, so we're going to kind of close the action, and then from here, allow the swing to happen and get back. I just use like a heavy bag on the stand. We're creating the movement that we want to see. So we're anchoring, we're connecting, we're creating all the lower body dynamics that we want, and then go ahead and swing to the back. So now here you can actually create counterpoint, close the gap, and swing to the back. So what's good about that is that you can actually use that mechanism for not only training the action that we're talking about, but also start to work on fundamentals. In terms of technique, so you can add a technique to the equation this last bit, so you've got that progression. So that's a basic progression that's lower body specific, that is a starting point progression. So it's not only basic in terms of when we're looking at PST or movement, but it's basic and it's starting, it's where we would start with somebody, and then obviously advance it as we go on. We'll talk about some of that stuff as we go forward. Now, it is a little after 9, so I do want to just cover here real quickly what we can do with slightly more advanced programs. So I won't go through all of this, but let's just do this here real quick. So if we look at what you can do now to advance a program, right? So here you'll see what I did was I have the same PST sequence 1 through 6, right? But what I did to start the process is with the same basic rep set type progression is I took that and I added in a dynamic warm-up. So I go through a hamstring stretch, external rotator stretch, a hip thrust, a psoas stretch, and then some bodyweight squats. The idea with this, I won't go through the whole thing because we don't have a ton of time, but I will explain it. In other words, I won't necessarily demonstrate it all, but let me explain it first and I can show you real quick. The sitting hamstring stretch is, in many cases, glute activation is an issue. Typically, quad activation is not, but glute activation can be an issue, and so we don't get good, strong, simultaneous hip extension to go with the knee extension. We become quad dominated. So, and one of the issues is hamstring, because of, for all the different reasons that quads may not be functioning, glutes might not be functioning, hamstring plays a role in trying to compensate for that. So if we stretch the hamstring in a longer 10+ second duration hold and start to sort of quiet the engagement of the hamstring down a little bit using sort of the stretch response and impact to sort of quiet down the hamstring's involvement, we can then activate our glutes. So what we're basically doing with that, maybe I'll just show you here real quick. I'll just take you through it. I can. So basically what I'm talking about doing here is using a standard forward bend, just your standard kind of hamstring stretch, right? And so you're essentially hip hinging, you want to look at their collars bending forward, the pops and all that, they're just kind of classic or whatever. But basically what you want to do is get a decent hold or a decent stretch on the hamstring for at least 10 seconds until they get that stretch response, until the nervous system lets go, relax a little bit, you get that real push. Usually what 10 to 12 seconds you feel that stretch in, let the nervous system shutting down the muscles a little bit, relaxing the stretch response, the trigger response to the stretch, and you get that nervous system quieting down the hamstring a little bit. Right? So if you do that a couple times, we're going to start to quiet down the hamstring, participate with the much, so that you turn up the movement and like that. So you can go from here to now using a simple stretch to create. So when we're translating the force from the ground up into the pelvis. So through the joint into the pelvis to create the rotational speed. When we're doing that, internal rotation of the hips is extremely important. Intra-axial rotation is short, but internal rotation is probably more important too, because the internal rotation, especially with the lead side, even the rear side when we're loading up, that allows for an effective pelvic movement around the joint. So once we've gone into a long duration hold here, stretch out the hamstrings, pop it down a little bit, we can go into a simple external rotator type of stretch. Can pull outside, IT all the way down, and we can, at the same time that we're doing that, we can create a common core movement. So you will, so for example, after you've done this, you bring our right knee up, straighten up the posture, get a good posture, the spine is hunched over, effective posture. Okay, so with my right, take my left, the spine around, use the other hand to the spine, pull my chest up, so my spine is a good posture, and I'm creating an upper thoracic pelvic differentiation. At the same time, I'm stretching the outside of the leg, from IT all the way down into the external rotator. So I'm getting a good stretch to improve my ability to rotate, and also stimulating the nervous system to create upper thoracic pelvic differentiation, which is the really important part of the swing method, letting the body be on the top. And so that's the first reason. And what we're doing then from there is so a hip thrust. This can be a bridge. It can be a hip thrust. I can use the switch while I'm doing it. There's all kinds of different variations for it. Let's just do a quick bridge. Very simple type of bridge. But if I look at so what I've done is first I got the hamstrings kind of quieted down. I've now created some pelvic mobility about the hip joints, especially internal rotation. At the same time I've done that, I'm using the pelvis and leg to create upper thoracic association. So I'm sort of working through the mechanisms that are going to be important in the overall spring of the lower body contribution. And now what I'm going to do is engage the glute. So all I'm doing here is we can use it as a thrust, feel like off the bench or a ball. So let's just use the bridge just as good. So all I'm doing here is I'm driving off my heels, engaging the glute and bridging up. So, and I want to quiet the hamstring, you can feel it, and I want to really engage the glute. So we can go through some dynamically a couple of that. So we start engaging, quiet down the hamstring, push out the heels a little bit, engage the glute more, but we start to say, wake up the glute, quiet down the hamstring, and look like that as well. So we're working through that. So then the hip flexor silhouette. So what we can do there is, remember extension is really important, right? So we want to stretch, we want to continue to stretch, obviously tighten to the front side is also an issue for a lot of people. We want to stretch hip flexors and silhouette, and we want to get some mobility on the front side. So we very standard sort of forward lunge, right? What we cool out the forward lunge is what we do is when we stretch this way, right, we're getting a silhouette, hip flexor stretch here, create some mobility as we just kind of work around the hip and structure. So but then, when we're in a lunge position like this, we are engaging isometrically, but we're engaging our quad to hold that position and our glute, right? So in this position, we definitely have isometric engagement of the quad and glute, right? So we're engaging the two primary areas that we want to use for force production, while at the same time we're creating some stretch to the front part of the hip and creating a little bit of better mobility, but also now creating some pelvic control through the pelvic tilt component. We can enhance the stretch by reaching up, so we can get higher and lower down at the quad, we can get a nice big stretch. We can even create a rotational movement here. So what I like to do is say do a reach, and then turn, and then switch sides. So when we go to the other side, get in a nice position where you're in that dynamic, you'll reach to stretch, really get a good stretch, and then do a dynamic turn. And with the idea being, you're now creating this differentiation, you're creating all the components that you need to sort of produce and move that speed, that stuff forward. The last thing is just a body weight squat. And I don't really go through this too much, but basically, now you're just a little bit more dynamic about dynamically getting in the squat position, driving, using extension. You want to have hip, knee, simultaneous extension, you want concurrent forces to be applied. So again, we're using this as a dynamic to create a dynamic where we're engaging and we want the head control out of there, so we want to drive or control that action to the pelvis. We want our glute and our quad, our hip and our knee engaged simultaneously. The last part of this more advanced system or more advanced program is just a Bulgarian split squat and an alternating forward lunge. So the split squat is a dynamic way to talk. We can use, I'm not going to do it, but we can elevate the rear foot. And basically what you're doing at that point, I think it makes it a little bit easier to perform it. But basically what you're doing here is you're essentially, with the split squat, is you're using one leg to create the downward force, to control the downward force, both at the quad and the glute, but also with the torso and pelvis. You've got the sort of torso pelvis control combined. So that's your downward. I can control my downward interface. Then when you go to your forward lunges, now you're controlling your downward interface. So now I lunge, I'm controlling your downward interface just like I did in the split squat. Now when I push back, I'm creating a shear force. So when I'm pushing here, I'm pushing against the ground this direction. When I drive out of this lunge, I'm pushing the same direction. So I'm learning how to create the interface, control the interface, use the interface to create a shear. And then so you now warm the body up. Now you go to the same basic level, activity-specific functional movement, but you have the benefit of having sort of stimulated or pre-stimulated the nervous system, warm the muscles up, more importantly, warm the nervous system. So I don't want to run late, but this is the last thing, just real quick. You can add then, ways to add, there's ways you can add strength conditioning into this. And the two ways that I would tell you that you should think about this is using more traditional strength conditioning components from two ways, or from two views. One is using the exercises to enhance the PST movements, and then secondly, to actually create more generically strength and power bases that will enhance the ability. So in one way, use exercises that are not rotationally, but movement specific, and then secondly, strength-based stuff that will improve or have impact on your ability to create those movements. So just really quick, I'm not going to go into any detail here, but just ideas between movement stuff. So we talked about the forward lunge, a basic squat, dumbbells and kettlebells. One-arm swings are movement specific. Figure eights with presses, stuff like that. Figure eight with a kettlebell with a press. Those are movement specific types of exercises that you can add in. And ways, and so you can use those types of exercises in conjunction with other exercises to create interval training and stuff like that. And again, this is ways to enhance your ability to produce movement, but ultimately you're relying on the initial PST I showed you as your primary mechanism for improving. This is more of a strength-based one. This is more of a power-based one. And again, you would want to go for speed and power after you did your strength-based. All this stuff will be online. I'll give you links to it so you can look at the slide presentation and all that kind of stuff and have this. And the videos I'll put up as soon as I possibly can. So I did run late. It seems like I can't help myself, but appreciate almost everybody hanging in there till the end here. It's all recorded. I get it online. I don't know if there's any questions. I'm going to shut the video off. If you got questions, type them in now while I'm shutting this stuff down. I'll try to answer any questions as quickly as I can, but as comprehensively as I can. And then, but if there isn't, I'll end the session. So thanks for bearing with me. There's a lot of information. I'm trying to do it in an overview way, but I don't want to chintz on it either. I don't want to shortchange anybody on the information that they're getting. So if we run over and whatnot. If you can't stay for the whole thing, that's fine too, because like I said, I'm recording these things, and everyone gets a chance to see them. I'm not going to hang out too much on it because I did run considerably over 20 minutes. So if there are any questions that you have, and if you can't get them in tonight, just email me or connect up with me. I've talked with somebody on the phone. I've emailed back and forth and Facebook back and forth with a bunch of people too. So if you have any questions, you can do that. I don't think there's any it doesn't seem like there's any questions. So I think I'll just wind down and end the session. So hopefully you followed all that stuff. It is data and information intensive, but it is still very basic in the tip of the iceberg. And there's certainly, as you get into it, you're going to have questions about the progression stuff and about, even just the dynamics of their reaction force and stuff like that. But what's been presented here is give you an incredible start for understanding mechanisms and then creating training programs that are going to have impact on performance. So I appreciate everyone sticking with us and joining tonight, and hopefully I see everyone next week when we talk about our core dynamics and then finish up with upper body and kind of pulling it all together. So everyone have a great day or evening wherever you're at, and we'll get the stuff all online. Check the Facebook and the baseball forum for it, and we'll see you next week. Thanks a lot.